Welcome to week 5 of my series to help international students adapt to university in China. Last week's episode focused on some of my own concerns. This week, we'll focus on some of the concerns of international students. 3 I've identified are saying or doing something inappropriate, potential for racism, experiencing racism, and loneliness. So, the first thing, saying or doing something inappropriate, requires a little bit of background. I've been in China for about 9 years and I've lived in 3 different cities and 2 different provinces. And I mentioned in my first video how I was totally fascinated by how different China was. And ever since then, I've been like investigating it, reading all about it, devouring videos about it, trying to just learn more and more. And now, after 9 years, I've learned quite a bit. And so I think this background is appropriate to share with you because I can't really say guarantee that every international student is going to have no problem no matter what university they attend in China. All I can give you is paint some broad brush strokes about Chinese history so you understand the mindset, which I've always been trying to understand. I'm getting clearer on about what kind of motivates Chinese, what China is about. The first big thing that took a while for me to come across is this notion of the great unity. This is like this idea that all the world's peoples will be united um, in the future. This is the dream of China, and it's been around since before Confucius, hundreds of years before Confucius, maybe like 700 years earlier. So it's been around for a long time in China. This is deeply embedded in the Chinese psyche. This is what I believe from my experiences. So this is what I'm really trying to understand is all the things we read about China, the history, how does it operate now or how do we see it now? And I would say that what's amazing about China is that a lot of these things still exist. They maybe have a modern twist to them, but they can be traced back to thinking thousands of years ago. And this is what I find so amazing with China. It's like going into a time warp in some ways in thinking. And so I would say this idea of the great unity is maybe what I've experienced. It can help explain what I've experienced in China because not only have I lived in 2 provinces and 3 cities, I've also traveled to 16 provinces. And I've traveled to some of the more remote areas and met, I think, upwards of 16 different minority groups, and interacted with them through having an interpreter. So this has come from a fairly broad experience of China. And I would say, like everywhere I've gone, I've been greeted really openly and in a friendly manner, almost never the opposite. And I've always found this really curious because I, like most people, think of China as really homogeneous, and that's what I thought when I first came to China. But as you're here longer and longer, you have different experiences and you realize there's a lot of diversity here, a lot more than you realize that's kind of hidden from you unless you live here. I think even a tourist trip here, you wouldn't get it if you live here and you start having these experiences. And let me give you an example. The first one I think of is the first city I lived in, Nanjing, which is one of the traditional ancient great capitals of China. I formed a cycling club for largely for foreigners to go on little cycling trips on the weekends. But we did have one Chinese participant and who knew English and Chinese. And of course, we needed him for when we needed translation because we were going into like villages, the small villages outside of the big city of Nanjing. And there was one time I remember on a cycling trip, and I believe this was the first time where you just had this kind of physical reaction, like, or aha kind of moment. And that was where we were in a fairly not that far from Nanjing, maybe 20 kilometers, like really not that far. And this is what makes it amazing is that we were in a little village and we were just trying to ask directions, like how to go somewhere from that village. And so we turned to our Chinese friend and he went to talk to the first person we came across, which is an older man, maybe 60s, 70s, something like that. And he went to communicate with them and he couldn't understand them. And I go, what? Like, we're only 20 kilometers from Nanjing. And it turned out this old man, I guess, did not know Mandarin. He only knew the local dialect. And our friend was not originally from that area, so he did not know that dialect. So he couldn't communicate with this man. And I just thought, wow, that's incredible. We're not that far from Nanjing, and you're coming across someone who doesn't know the language. And so suddenly I started looking at China a little differently, that there's all these dialects here also, in addition to the Mandarin language that everyone is taught. And so that, kind of broke up my idea a bit of homogeneity. And then another story, when I was teaching my courses at the university in Nanjing, the students wanted to have a big sort of banquet dinner after we finished the course, a farewell dinner, and we did, and it was great fun and so on, and all sorts of food. But at the end, we had some extra time and someone wanted to play some games, and so they came up with a game about dialects that everyone go around the table and speak in their dialect, and or else you could even imitate the accent of people outside of China, from other countries. But it was mainly dialects. And I thought, oh, this is so right away. It's like, well, why are we playing this game? And then you start asking and you find out, well, it's because virtually everyone in the class spoke a different dialect. And we're all from, I was in one of the most populated provinces of China in the east, the developed part of China, the part that you would think that would be more homogeneous, in terms of development versus some remote area in the Himalayan mountains or something. But no, we were in the east and we're in one of the most populated advanced provinces, Jiangsu province. Nanjing is the capital of Jiangsu province. And here we were, and they were telling me there's all these different dialects, and I had no idea. I'd been teaching them for 4 months, and of course, all I hear would be English and Mandarin. Never really heard the dialects. So this is invisible, right? So if you're a tourist, you would not know this. And another story, even to back it up even further, is that several times I would go after class or on weekends or something for walks with a group of students. They might accompany me and we'd just go for a walk. And there's a really nice park across the road. And we'd go walk around the lake and just, have a chit chat. And so we'd be walking along. And I remember someone's cell phone rang and then they went on the phone, one of the students, and kind of left us as a group so that they could hear. And I'm listening and I'm going, that doesn't sound like Mandarin that they're speaking. And so I turned to one of the other students and I just said, what are they speaking? And then the other student just said, this is how we tell in China when someone is speaking to their family because it switches to the local dialect. And going, you're kidding. And so they said, yeah. So what we know just from listening to this dialect, it would be the dialect of that student. And this means they're talking to a family member. And I go, wow. And so these three stories just reinforced it. And you just don't hear about this in the media. It's completely hidden. So while the vast majority of people there's still this underneath it all these different dialects. And then I guess even another story, I met a professor here at this university I teach at, and he teaches Chinese and he specializes in dialects. And I know when we went to have dinner once, we were at this Korean restaurant eating, and then someone came up at our next table, I believe it was. I don't think we knew them or anyone knew them, but they just started speaking. And right away, my professor friend said, "Ah, that person is from my community, my home community." And I go, "Well, how do you know?" Said, "Well, it's the same dialect. I understand them." And so this is all hidden from, I think, the vast majority of the West. You hear nothing about this. And so I'm trying to tell you that there's way more diversity in China. And so they aren't this so much an us and them way of looking at the world. It does exist, we're Chinese, you're not, or you're a foreigner. That does exist, but it doesn't go as deep as you might think it does because of all these dialects. And then on top of this, of course, which is well known, is China has 56 different minorities. One is the Han minority, or it's not a minority, that's majority, the vast majority, and the other 55 are different minority groups. And I met maybe about 16 different minority groups as part of the research I was trying to conduct on community forestry. I went to some of the traditional places in China where they still have a lot of forests and a lot of minority groups. So I've met these groups. And sometimes to add to this is my translator assistant couldn't translate for me. We had to find someone who knew the dialect, for instance. So even more reinforcement of all the different dialects. And so anyway, this idea of all these minorities, if you go to some of these more remote regions, you'll discover they're governed differently. And it's according to the dominance of that minority in that region. I don't know all the particulars, but what I can say is that I had to, because of my community forestry and trying to figure out a place to do the research, I did a fair bit of reading and interacting with my translator assistant, and I discovered, there's these we were in what was an example? We were in the Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture, it was called. So it was an area, I believe, in a city in China, and this was Shangri-La. And it was an area called the Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture. So local unit of governance and part of the city, I believe. And anyway, in that particular area, there would have been, I don't know, maybe 50% or more of the Tibetan minority. And so this is in Yunnan province. We weren't in Tibet. And so they had a special area where their government, or at least Tibetans, were in the majority, I believe. And so they played a more prominent role in the governance. And I don't know the extent to which it would have reflected their culture, but this is all over China. There's there's autonomous regions. So Western China, there be a different Xinjiang, I believe, is an autonomous region. So that's a whole province size area that is largely dominated by the Uyghur minority. And so they're Muslim and so on. And so their governance would take precedence, or their involvement in government would take precedence over other minorities in that area because of the numbers of people from the Uyghur minority. And so these are all over. So it's at the provincial level. I'm not sure how many, five just popped into my head, something like that. There might be five autonomous regions. And then in terms of autonomous prefectures, many more, 20 just popped into my head because I've done some reading on this. But there's governance for different groups. And so there's this respect for different minorities in China, and some of them can be quite small. And so I think China, and I've detected it because That said earlier, I'm from Toronto, Canada, which is the most multicultural city in the world. And I would say the kind of mindset we have in Toronto of respecting other people from other cultures and countries is something I kind of feel here. I feel kind of at home in China in this way. And so I've always wondered where this comes from. When I first came to China, because I thought it was homogeneous. But as I say, I've done this research, had these experiences, and now I'm starting to get it more, that there's a lot more diversity underneath that you don't see. So I've told you about governance, I've told you about dialects. And so I think there's this whole attitude. And the other thing, the big dream of Chinese people, as I say, the great unity, is to go back to the times of the Tang Dynasty. And so that was something like 1400 years ago, 608, I think, something like that, to 907. And anyway, so this was a dynasty that was probably the most dominant in Chinese history. And of course, it's at what was one end of the Silk Road, and it was based in Xi'an, which is where the terracotta warriors are. It was called Chang'an then. And anyway, because it was at one end of the Silk Road, there's great diversity in the city. It was the biggest city in the world at the time, Chang'an, and it had the greatest diversity, cultural diversity. And so there's all different religions and of all different types in the city. And so what I've come again from living in China, interacting with people, I've come to discover the big dream that people have is about China returning to those times, because that's when it was sort of the greatest in its history in the minds of Chinese. And their dream is to return to that time. And that what was key about that time was the multiculturalism and the art, the mixing of different ideas that came from the Middle East to China, that affected pottery and ceramics and painting and design. And so this is what China dreams about. And so when you come here from a different country, I would urge you to keep that frame in mind, and that they're pretty open to different cultures. And it's difficult for me to speak, say, on behalf of Black people, obviously, because I'm white, and maybe younger people because I'm older, but I think you can use this frame to the way you look at China when you come here. If there is sort of any kind of, so getting into the second question, racism, I would say it's just based on ignorance, lack of experience interacting with someone from that culture. So if there's something that incident occurs with Black people, that's what I would tend to say. It has more to do with just that ignorance, that lack of experience interacting with Black people, having not seen Black people before. I wouldn't say it's a deep rooted kind of racism that I kind of think about, say, in North America and some of the most racist places in North America or Europe. I would just say it has more to do with ignorance. So that would be my guideline for that. So those first two things are related, saying something inappropriate. And so in the end, so to tie it more tightly back to that, I would say no, they're open. They have this sort of openness to different cultures underneath what you think. So if you say something inappropriate according to their culture, they're pretty understanding about that, not expecting you to know their whole culture, and you being from a different one. Well, they're well aware of cultural differences, I would say. And so, yeah, I don't think you really have to worry about that. And as I say, the racism, if you come across it, which I rarely hear about, I've heard a little bit from people I've met and whatnot, but I don't think it goes deep. I've had conversations with Chinese about this, Chinese people, and that's what they maintain. It's like really comes from a place of ignorance. And I would say that I think that's largely true. Okay, and now the third thing, loneliness. First, it wouldn't matter which country you went to for your university degree. Loneliness is potentially what you could feel by coming, leaving your own culture. So it is potentially something you'll experience. I told about my personal story in an earlier video, and I would say, at least in my experience, I felt almost the opposite. And it's because I figured out I came from an individualistic where people don't kind of look out for other people so much. They just look out for themselves. And so when I came to China, a collective culture, I found people were looking out for me. Even though I'm from a different culture, they didn't know my language. I would get different ways of people helping me. So, for instance, I'd be in a cafeteria. Maybe I'm struggling with eating some Chinese food. And I once had an older man come over to me and just hand me a spoon, and he couldn't speak to me. He didn't know any English, and I didn't know enough Chinese. We couldn't speak with each other, but the understanding was there. He was helping me. He watched me struggle with something and brought a spoon over. And so that gave me such a warm feeling that people are looking out for me, that first I stand out, I'm not Chinese. And so that bothers some people, but it doesn't bother me because my experience of it is that I haven't been a target of anything terrible. I never felt that. I've been a target of helpfulness. So if I lost on a subway or something like that, someone might even come up to me and say, can I help you? You look lost. And this kind of thing happens all the time. I don't really have to turn to anyone even to ask for help. And this has happened in so many places, so many times. I have to say, this is China. And so, on a subway, they might help me. They might ride with me if I'm clueless about where I'm going or something. And so this has happened many times. So I felt the opposite of loneliness. I've kind of felt a community instantly. I mean, even some of the first words I heard when I arrived in China was "Welcome to China." And it made me feel like I was entering this small village called China, which is hard to believe, considering it's 1.4 billion people. But that's the feeling that I had. I still hear this, "Welcome to China." I've heard it all over the place, just like, to the community of China. And so, anyway, the loneliness, I would say the best way I'm trying to understand why it's been such a positive experience for me in China. I would say a big part of it, maybe, is because I'm really curious about the culture. I have been from day one, and I'm always asking questions about the culture. And people love it that I'm really interested in it. And if I discover something about it, like a revelation compared to my own Western culture, I often will post something on WeChat about it, and just how I admire this thing about China that I've noticed that doesn't, we don't have in my own Western culture in Canada. And so I do that regularly. It's just normal. And it's just my path of discovery and learning in China. If I see something really good, I want to talk about it, mention it. And I guess people feel that in me. When I go into the city, I've got a big smile on my face. I'm always exploring and checking stuff out constantly and questions. And I think they just love it because they want to promote their culture, because they know they've been isolated from the world for years before the opening up, and that the world does not understand China. And so that's the best advice I can give. And in terms of interacting with Chinese people, and of course, you're going to meet other international students and so on. But I see it as it's like China wants the world to be one big family because China's focus is on the family. And so that's the way it thinks of relationships. And there's evidence of that throughout history. China is known for its unity, not its division. So, where Europe, similar sized area to China, was originally under the Roman Empire and unified, it split apart and it has never unified since. And that's where a couple world wars have started. And through that whole same period, China initially was a whole bunch of warring states. And so, there's a warring states period in Chinese history where, the area that comprises modern day China was a whole bunch of different states warring for control. Constant wars, like hundreds of years of wars. And this is when Confucius came and rose up and talked about ethics and the importance of that to governance and to be a good person. So the leader should be a good person, an ethical person, be a model of behavior for the citizens. And so it took a while for this to take root, but it did eventually in a few hundred years later, and it's just evolved since then. And so it's China has become unified over that same period where Europe has basically split. And so this is deep in the Chinese psyche and history. And so when you come here, and this is part of the reason why I have no problem helping the world understand China with the idea that you can come here and complete a university degree, because I see this holistic way of looking at the world as only positive. It's so positive that I think the whole world needs to learn this about China. This is what I've learned, and I'm saving you years and years of reading by, sharing the knowledge I've gained from experience on the ground every day. I've been in China for 9 years, as well as the endless reading of, top academics and experts on China and Chinese history. And so I can save you a lot of time doing that. Anyway, that's enough for week 5, and we'll see you in week 6.